son-in-law said it right to my face, at my own daughter's dinner table. "Roberta, no offense, but when exactly are you planning to get your own place?" I was 69 years old. I had just moved in with them 8 weeks earlier, after my husband of 41 years passed away from a heart attack in the middle of a Tuesday morning while I was at the grocery store buying him his favourite orange marmalade. I came home to an ambulance in the driveway and a paramedic who couldn't look me in the eye. And sitting there at that dinner table, holding a fork I hadn't used yet, I thought, I have $2,340,000 in a trust account that not a single person in this room knows about. I didn't say that, of course. I set my fork down, dabbed my mouth with the napkin and said, "I'm looking into a few options." Then I excused myself and went to the guest bathroom and stood at the sink for a long time, staring at the faucet. Let me back up. Because none of this starts at that dinner table. It starts with my brother, Clifford. Clifford was 6 years older than me. We grew up in Akron, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and nobody had very much, but nobody talked about it. Clifford was the smart one. Not that I wasn't smart, but Clifford had a different kind of intelligence. The kind that made people trust him. The kind that made him seem like he always knew something you didn't. He went to Cleveland State on a partial scholarship, got a business degree, and spent the next 4 decades building a small logistics company in Phoenix that apparently was worth considerably more than any of us had understood. We weren't close in the way some siblings are. We talked on birthdays, at Christmas, sometimes in between. After our mother died, it was mostly just Christmas. He never married, never explained why, and I never pushed. Some people just move through life differently. When Clifford died of pancreatic cancer, 18 months before my husband passed, I flew out to Phoenix for the service. It was a small gathering, some business colleagues, a neighbour who had checked on him near the end, a woman named something I can't remember who handled his affairs. I stood by a catered table of food that no one was eating, and thought about how strange it was that a person could be that successful and still have such a quiet funeral. 3 months later, I got a letter from a law firm in Phoenix. I was still married then, still living in the house in Dayton we'd owned for 22 years. My husband. I'll call him my husband because some things belong just to me, was in the living room watching the news when I opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Clifford had left everything to me. I sat with that letter for a very long time. The law firm wanted me to come to Phoenix to finalize things, or we could handle it remotely with a notary. The estate included the sale of his company, already completed, plus a commercial property in Scottsdale, investment accounts, and a life insurance policy. After taxes and legal fees, the total coming to me was $2,340,000. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the filing cabinet in the bedroom where I kept our tax returns and insurance documents. I told my husband dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. I don't know why I didn't tell him right then. I think I needed to understand it myself first. And then time passed the way time does, and I kept meaning to bring it up, and then he died, and then there was no one to tell. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, had been after me for months after her father passed. She called every evening. She worried, she said, about me being alone in that big house. She said the winters in Dayton were no good for a woman living alone. She and my son-in-law had a finished basement they'd never used, a proper bedroom and bath down there. They wanted me to come. I should have asked more questions. My daughter meant well, I believe that completely. But meaning well and thinking things through are two different things, and I don't think either of us understood what it would feel like once I was actually there. The basement was nice. It was clean, it had a good mattress, and my son-in-law had installed a small refrigerator for me, which I appreciated. But it was still a basement. I could hear every footstep above me. I knew when they argued and when they made up. I knew what time the grandchildren woke up, and I knew when my son-in-law got home late, and I knew from the rhythm of footsteps and voices whether it had been a good day or a difficult one. I tried to be useful. I helped with the grandchildren, picking them up from school twice a week, helping with homework, reading to them at night when my daughter was tired. I cooked when I could see the kitchen was open. I stayed out of the way when the kitchen was busy. I tried to read the household the way you read weather, looking for signs of what was coming. But my son-in-law had not been consulted the way I later understood. My daughter had made the invitation and he had agreed, technically, but there's a difference between agreeing to something and wanting it. I could feel that difference in every room I walked into. He wasn't mean. I want to be fair about that. He didn't yell or belittle. He was something harder to name. The way he'd get very quiet when I came upstairs, the way conversations would shift slightly when I entered, the way he'd say the four of us were making plans and catch himself and say, "Well, you know what I mean," without finishing the correction. After about 6 weeks, I stopped going upstairs after 7 in the evening. Then came the dinner. It was a Sunday. My daughter had made pot roast, which had always been my recipe that I'd taught her. We were talking about nothing in particular, the grandchildren's school, something on television, and then there was a small silence, and my son-in-law filled it. "Roberta, no offence, but when exactly are you planning to get your own place?" My daughter said his name sharply, the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop, but it's already too late. He held up both hands. "I'm just asking. It's been 2 months. I think it's a fair question." My daughter looked at me. Her face was doing something complicated. She was embarrassed, and also, I could tell, she'd been wondering the same thing. I said I was looking into options. That night in the basement, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Clifford, about that letter, about the filing cabinet in the bedroom of a house I'd sold 4 months ago, and the new file folder in my own documents where I'd moved everything. I thought about the estate account in Phoenix that the law firm had set up, and the trust documents I'd signed with an attorney in Dayton before the house sold, all of it done carefully and quietly, the way Clifford himself had always moved through the world. I thought about what it meant that I had $2,340,000 and was sleeping in my daughter's basement because I hadn't trusted myself to figure out what came next. The next morning, I called the estate attorney in Phoenix, a woman I'd only spoken to twice but who had a calm, no-nonsense manner I respected. I told her I was ready to talk about moving the funds into a more active management structure. She asked how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to look at real estate, something modest, something just for me, and I wanted to understand what that process would look like if I paid cash. She explained everything clearly. There would be no mortgage process to navigate, no bank approvals, no waiting. I would need to work with a local real estate attorney in whatever state I purchased, have the funds wired from the trust, and close when both parties were ready. She said a clean cash transaction on a residential property could close in as little as 2 to 3 weeks if everything was in order. I thanked her and sat quietly in the basement bathroom, the only room with a door that locked, for a long time after. The following week, I told my daughter I needed to run some errands. She offered to drive me. I said I'd take a rideshare. I needed some time to myself. I was still adjusting. She understood that she'd been giving me space around grief. What she didn't know was that my grief was not what I was tending to that afternoon. I'd been looking at properties online for 2 weeks. I knew exactly what I wanted. Nothing large, nothing showy, nothing that would require upkeep I couldn't manage. I wanted something single-story with good light, a small yard, in a neighborhood where I could walk. I had found a development about 40 minutes away, a community specifically for adults 55 and over, with a pool, a clubhouse, a few activities I might actually enjoy. The homes were 2-bedroom, 2-bath. They were selling for around $340,000. I met the sales representative alone. She was a young woman, very enthusiastic, the kind of person who talks with her hands. She walked me through a model unit. It had hardwood floors and a kitchen with a gas stove and a screened-in porch that looked out over a small pond. There were geese on the pond, I watched them for a moment through the screen. "Are you looking for yourself?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "just for me." She asked about financing. I told her I'd be paying cash. The enthusiasm became something slightly different then. Not more, not less, but more attentive. She pulled out a different folder. I put down a $10,000 deposit that afternoon, drawn from a personal checking account I'd opened separately. An account my daughter didn't know about, that was linked only to the trust and used only for trust expenses. The sales representative said the earliest closing date available was 26 days out. I drove back to my daughter's house and made dinner for everyone. That was the strangest part of those weeks, moving through an ordinary life while carrying something extraordinary underneath it. Helping with homework, watching television, saying good morning to my son-in-law in the kitchen, and watching him nod without quite making eye contact. I thought about telling my daughter. I rehearsed it sometimes. Lying in the basement in the dark, "I have something to tell you. Clifford left me some money. I've bought a house." But I kept thinking about that dinner table, about his face when he said no offense, about my daughter's face which told me she'd been thinking the same thing and hadn't said it herself. I thought about how differently they might have treated me if they'd known, and something about that thought made me want to keep it to myself a little longer, not to punish them, just to know for a little while what it felt like to have something that was entirely mine. Closing day was a Thursday. I arranged for the wire transfer 3 days in advance with the Phoenix attorney, who confirmed it was processed the evening before. I told my daughter I had an appointment, medical. I let her assume, because I didn't correct the assumption. She said to let her know if I needed anything. I sat at a conference table at a real estate attorney's office in a suburb I was about to call home. The attorney, a quiet man in his 60s who reminded me a little of Clifford, went through the documents methodically. I signed where indicated. He explained each item without rushing. When it was done, he handed me a set of keys on a simple ring and said, "Congratulations, Miss Whitmore, it's all yours." I sat in the parking lot of that office for about 15 minutes. I'd owned a home before, of course, 22 years in Dayton, which we'd bought young and paid off slowly, and eventually sold after my husband passed. But this was different. This house was in my name, purchased with money that had come to me alone, decided by me alone, signed by me alone. There was no one to consult, no one to compromise with, no one whose opinion had shaped any part of this. It was a very quiet 15 minutes. I called a moving company that same afternoon. Not a large one. I didn't have much. The furniture in the basement was my daughter's. I had my personal belongings, clothing, books, my husband's photograph, a box of kitchen items I'd brought from Dayton, a few things of my mother's that I'd kept. It amounted to not very much. The moving company said they could come Saturday, 2 days out. That evening, I came upstairs for dinner. My daughter had made pasta. My son-in-law was already at the table, scrolling his phone. The grandchildren were loud and beautiful. I sat down and helped my granddaughter cut her food, and I watched my grandson perform a magic trick he'd been practicing all week. He kept dropping the coin, and we all pretended not to notice. I laughed at the right moments. I ate all of my pasta. After dinner, while my daughter was loading the dishwasher, I stood in the kitchen doorway. "I have something to tell you both," I said. My son-in-law looked up from his phone. "I found a place," I said. "I'll be moving on Saturday." My daughter turned around from the sink. Her expression was harder to read than I expected. Relief, I think, but also something softer, something that might have been concern arriving too late. "Saturday," she said. "That's so soon. Where?" I told her about the community, the development, the pond, the geese. I didn't tell her how I'd paid for it. I said I'd received some money from Clifford's estate, and that I'd been handling it quietly because I needed to work through it myself. Both of which were true. My son-in-law said, "Good for you, Roberta. His voice was genuine. I think he meant it without any irony, and I chose to take it that way. My daughter cried a little. Not from sadness exactly, she's not easily sad, but from the surprise of it, I think. From realizing her mother had been doing things she didn't know about, moving in directions she hadn't seen. I moved on Saturday. The movers were professional and fast. 2 men who had my belongings loaded and driving inside of 45 minutes. My daughter stood in the driveway with her arms crossed against the November cold. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door. The grandchildren had been told I was getting my own apartment and thought this was exciting and wanted to know if I'd have a pool. I told them yes, there was a pool, and they could come swim in the summer. The house was empty when the movers carried my things inside. It smelled of fresh paint and something faintly like cedar. My box of kitchen items went on the counter. My mother's small framed embroidery went on the wall in the hallway. A simple piece, blue flowers, that she'd made when she was young and I'd always loved. My husband's photograph went on the nightstand in the bedroom. I stood on the screened porch as the movers drove away. The pond was there. The geese were there, 4 or 5 of them, moving slowly at the water's edge like they had all the time in the world. I thought about Clifford, about how he'd spent his whole life building something and never quite found a way to say what he'd wanted for himself, about how he'd left it all to me without explanation, without conditions, without any note beyond the legal language of a will, just a quiet, enormous gesture from one sibling to another, across decades of Christmas calls and not enough visits. I thought he would have liked this porch, the water, the geese. In the weeks that followed, I did things I hadn't done in years. I signed up for the watercolour class at the clubhouse, badly as it turned out, but enjoyably so. I found a grocery store I liked and a coffee shop around the corner from the entrance to the development where an older man named something I never caught always had the crossword spread open on his table and always nodded when I came in. I had my daughter and the grandchildren over for lunch on a Sunday in December, and my son-in-law came too, and we sat on the porch. It was cold, but we bundled up and watched the geese and ate the soup I'd made, and it was the most comfortable I'd felt with them since before I'd moved in. Nobody asked me how I paid for the house. I didn't volunteer it. My daughter called more often now, not out of obligation, I could tell, but because something had shifted. I was no longer a situation to be managed. I was just her mother again, living my own life, and that made it easier for us both to simply talk. I had a trust set up properly, a revocable living trust, advised by the Phoenix attorney and a financial planner in my new city, and I spent several months getting that structured the way I wanted it. I gave thought to my grandchildren's educations. I gave thought to the causes my husband had cared about. I gave thought to what Clifford would have wanted me to do with something he'd worked 40 years to build. I didn't make any grand gestures. I didn't punish anyone or reward anyone dramatically. I just made careful, considered decisions, one at a time, the way you do when you finally, at 69 years old, figured out that the life you're living is yours to design. There is a particular freedom that comes not from having money, but from not needing to explain yourself, from moving through your days without auditing your choices against someone else's expectations. I hadn't understood how much of my life I'd spent managing other people's comfort until I stopped doing it. I think about that dinner table sometimes. My son-in-law's hands going up, no offence. The way that phrase is always an announcement. That offence is exactly what's coming. The way I folded my napkin and said I was looking into options. I just didn't explain which ones. The geese are still there when I sit on the porch now. They become something like companions, in the way that wild things can become companions when you watch them long enough. Not tame, not yours, just present. Reliably, beautifully present. Clifford never explained himself either. He just showed up quietly at exactly the right moment in the form of a letter in a plain envelope from a law firm in Phoenix. I think about that a lot these days, about the ways people love you without saying it, about the ways a life well lived leaves things behind, about how it's never too late to step into a house of your own, close the door gently, and begin. I've thought a lot about what made Clifford the way he was. He never asked anyone for approval. He never announced his plans. He just worked, quietly and steadily, for 40 years, and when it was over, what he left behind spoke for everything he never said out loud. I used to think that was loneliness. Now I think it was something else. A kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience. When my son-in-law asked me when I was getting my own place, he wasn't being cruel in the way that people who mean to wound usually are. He was just careless, and I've learned at 69 that carelessness can do just as much damage as cruelty, sometimes more, because it doesn't even bother to notice what it's broken. But here's what I kept coming back to in those weeks in the basement. I could have said something. I could have defended myself, made them feel guilty, told them about Clifford's money right then at that dinner table just to watch his expression change. Part of me wanted to. That part is real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I didn't, not because I was passive, because I understood, maybe for the first time in my life, that doing the right thing quietly, without an audience, is its own kind of power. Clifford knew that. It took me 69 years to learn it. What I did in those weeks required more from me than I expected. Not courage in any dramatic sense. No one was watching. No one would have known if I'd fallen apart. But a steadiness, a willingness to think clearly when I was grieving, to make decisions when it would have been much easier to let someone else make them, to sit across a dinner table from people who underestimated me and simply not correct them yet. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from nowhere. You build it slowly out of every hard thing you survived and kept moving through anyway. I also had to be smart about it, not in a calculating way, but in the way that my brother was smart, asking the right questions, trusting the right people, understanding that money without a plan is just noise. I called the attorney. I found the right financial guidance. I read every document before I signed it. Clifford had given me something extraordinary, and the least I could do was be worthy of it, to manage it thoughtfully rather than react to it emotionally. What I want to say to anyone who finds themselves in a room where they feel invisible, where someone has looked through them instead of at them, is this. Your circumstances do not determine your trajectory. What happened to me at that dinner table wasn't the end of a story. It was the moment I decided to write the next chapter myself. Not in anger, not in revenge, just in clear-eyed, deliberate motion towards something better. Roberta Whitmore? That's me, sitting on a screen porch watching geese move across still water. Got here by being decent when it would have been easier not to, by thinking carefully when it would have been easier to react, and by refusing to stop when stopping felt most justified. That's all any of us can do, and most days it turns out to be enough.